Chris Guillebeau, welcome back to the show.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brett. It's a huge honor to be back.
Right, yeah. You were one of my first podcast guests back in 2010, I think.
Wow, still going strong.
Still going strong.
Awesome.
That was when I was in my apartment, and I was working out of my son's bedroom.
Wow, before the Manliness mansion.
Right, I wish it was a Manliness mansion. Well, hey, you've got a new book out. It's called Born for This. And it's about finding your dream job, whether that's starting your own business or getting the job in a traditional workspace that you've always wanted. And I love how you get into details, not just high level. You actually get into specifics on what people need to do to get the job of their dreams. But I love how you start out the book talking about a lot of the most common misguided scripts people have about their careers. Can you talk about what some of those are and what they can do to flip them so it's more productive?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for the kind words. My goal with the book, and probably all of my books, is to write something that's truly prescriptive and actionable and helpful. So with this book, Born for This, I followed a case study model where I interviewed and studied lots of different people who had found or created their dream jobs, as you said. And my goal is always to kind of extrapolate the lessons, look at what is statistically significant, what is relevant, what the average person can do. So it's not just a historical study. It's meant to be like, here, read this book and then go and do these things. And so, one of the things I was most surprised by is that, most people tend to look at really successful people and they think, okay, they not only do they have it all figured out now, but they've actually always had it figured out. And what I was surprised to see is that most successful people, whether celebrities, very wealthy people, or just like, average people who are living a very fulfilled life, were doing something that they love to do, had a good income, they actually did not follow a linear path. And they actually had no idea necessarily what they, when they were 6 years old and thought about, okay, here's what I want to do when I grow up, it rarely turned into that thing. And even when they were trying to decide what to study in college, or even for their first job, or whatever they did in those early career stages, there were lots of kind of winding roads and going back to a path and choosing something different. So I thought that was really interesting because it goes against this, conventional wisdom that there is this one straight path that you have to follow. And maybe another thing is, there's a lot of advice that's kind of handed down, and we kind of accept it as, okay, this is truth. And one of the things that I see a lot in business literature advising people how to be better employees or better managers is this concept of think like a CEO. And it kind of takes this role model of a very famous person or a CEO of a big company and says, here's how this person lives their life. Therefore, you should live your life the same way. And so there's lots of articles about here's how Warren Buffett invests. Therefore, you should invest this way. Or here's how Mark Zuckerberg manages. This is how you should manage. And the problem, of course, is most of us are not Mark Zuckerberg. Most of us are not Warren Buffett. It doesn't mean that we're not intelligent, but we don't have access to those same resources. We don't have tens of thousands of employees or billions of dollars, to just deploy at will. So what I kind of learned was maybe it's better to actually think like a janitor, not like a CEO, because the janitor is actually, not sitting on top of billions of dollars and tens of thousands of employees. The janitor actually kind of has his hand or her hand in everything and knows everybody in the building, and is kind of, multifaceted and is able to respond to different things. So the lesson is not so much, be a janitor, of course, but the lesson is to think differently and figure out, okay, out of all this different advice, what actually applies to you, and how can you do something that will help you succeed or you kind of further along your career.
Yeah, I love how you brought up the whole think like a CEO, because I find those articles, I find them entertaining but also annoying, because I've read about there's what's besides like you're not them, right? You're not Warren Buffett. You don't have the resources, so what works for him isn't going to work for you. But even with some of these articles about like what the most successful people do first thing in the morning,
right.
articles that you read, like the underlying assumption is that, well, if you do these things too, you too will be successful. And there's people written about this. There's like a psychological bias going on. It's like the survivorship bias.
Interesting.
I don't know if you've heard of this. So it's the idea that with these articles, you only focus on the people who are successful and did these things. But out of the people you don't have in that pool are the people who did those things but weren't successful.
Right. So it's like you said, it's entertaining. It's interesting to read those articles. That's why they're popular. It's like reading People magazine or something, which is fine, but it doesn't necessarily, give us actionable advice. It doesn't necessarily tell us what to do. And for every article that's like, here's what these successful people do in the morning. They never check email. There's probably somebody else who is successful who gets up and checks his email in the morning.
Right.
And that's fine,
Yeah. So, but the key is you have to, instead of relying on that, you have to experiment and find out what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of experimentation.
Right, and we'll get into a little bit of that more in here in a bit. But you also talk, you kind of go after the very common advice that you see in the online entrepreneurial world is like you got to follow your passion, and once you
Uh-huh.
find your passion and follow it, the money will follow. But
Yeah.
you say it's misguided advice. Why is that?
It's totally misguided. I mean, if you're trying to figure out, okay, what do I like to do, or what do I want to do for a hobby, then that's a great question to ask. But there are lots of passions you can have that don't necessarily make for great careers. I was like, the story I always tell is when I was a kid, I was very passionate about playing video games, and not just as a kid, but even in my like late teens, early 20s. I was really devoted, to sitting in front of the TV or the computer and playing games. That wasn't going to lead me to a career or a dream job, or it was just something that I did for fun. And even if it's something that maybe is a little bit more applicable, it doesn't necessarily correlate to, okay, here's my career path. Maybe it's just something that you do that's fun and enjoyable, and it's a diversion. So I think it's probably more important to follow your skill. Don't just follow a passion, or if you are going to follow a passion, choose one, because most of us have more than one thing we like. Choose one that's actually kind of relevant in a way that other people care about. If you can do something that's helpful to other people, that to me is kind of the key to starting a business, or to getting ahead in your job, or to changing careers. There's all this talk about value. Speaking of overused concepts and advice that's always handed down, there's always this thing about adding value. Go add value. Go add value. Well, what does that mean? That means essentially be helpful. Figure out what you can do to better serve your colleagues, to better help your company or organization, to help people get ahead. That I think is the key, far more than following your passion.
All right, be useful.
Yeah.
I like that. So you talk about three things that people should consider when they are trying to decide what they do for a living. I thought this was really useful because, particularly when you're young, you tend to focus on just one
Hmm.
or the other and not all of them at once, or you might not even think about any of them. You might be thinking about other factors that aren't really geared towards your well-being. But what are these three things people should consider when they're thinking about a job or starting a business?
Sure. Yeah. So the model that I used in the book, which kind of emerged through all the research, it's not like I set out and said, here's this model. Like, it kind of emerged through all the different interviews with people. And the model is joy, money, flow. So these are these three qualities that I think are the essential elements or ingredients to a very successful career, something that's fulfilling and purposeful. And so joy is doing something that you love to do. I just talked about how you shouldn't follow your passion, but at the same time, I think life is short. In this age with many opportunities and possibilities, why shouldn't we work toward finding something that is enjoyable to us, so that work is not just kind of a drudgery. It's not just like a soul-sucking job that you go to in order to pay the bills. So the first one is joy. Second one is money, because I am interested in helping people with their careers. It's not just you're something that you like to do. The ideal dream job is actually financially viable. It is sustainable. It provides everything you need to support yourself and to support your family. And then the third element that I was maybe not surprised at, but I was surprised how important it was what I called flow. And flow is essentially like deploying your skills in a unique way, or in a way that kind of makes sense to you. It's like doing work that you're really good at, that you can kind of immerse yourself in, that you lose yourself in, like time goes by and you don't realize like, oh, an hour has gone by because I've been like lost in this project. And sometimes people can't identify like what the flow is in their life. They don't know necessarily like what's the skill that I'm really good at that other people aren't. So one tip that I learned was, if you do any kind of group work, if you have meetings or you're working on a team, pay attention when kind of tasks are divvied up and they kind of look at you and they're like, oh, Brett should do this. And everybody kind of recognizes your skill, even if you don't necessarily see it for yourself. So you got joy, money, flow. And, throughout life, we have to make different compromises. We have to settle in some ways. But I think the goal of self-actualization, the goal of improving ourselves, to be the best man or the best woman we can be, is to get as close as possible to that convergence where we truly do love what we do. It is actually sustainable. And we're also doing something that we're good at.
And I like it with the money thing. You focus on sustainability. It's not necessarily meaning you have to make buku of money.
Of course, yeah. Well, I mean, true wealth is not buku of money, right? True wealth is, we have everything that we need. We are able to do the things that we want, but we're also able to give. We're able to support others, and we have healthy relationships. So we're pursuing something that matters to us. I mean, this is true wealth.
Right, right. Yeah, 'cause a lot of people, they'll go for the money, but then they just hate their job. They
Right.
they don't enjoy it. Their family is terrible. Family life's terrible.
Hmm.
Throughout the book, you talk about how landing your dream job is often seen as a lottery, right? Just
Hmm.
a few lucky people get to do what they love, and I guess there is some truth to that. I mean, the world, it's competitive. It's
Hmm.
hard. There's only few limited spots for some, ideal jobs that a lot of people want. If you're starting a business, there's risk inherent in that.
Sure.
But what are some things that people can do to mitigate the risk and put the odds more in their favor?
Yeah, so this concept of lottery, it actually came from some of the respondents in the survey, and they tended to use the same kind of language. They talked about this dream job concept. They said, I feel like I've won the career lottery. I love what I do. I would go to work even if I didn't get paid for it, but fortunately I do get paid for it. So I kind of wanted to unpack that a little bit. And maybe one of the things I learned was that a lot of risk is perceived. It doesn't necessarily mean that something isn't risky. There's risk when you walk outside of your house or something, but a lot of risk really is perceived. And people who did quit their job to start a business, or people who kind of just made a career transition within the same organization or company, or to a different organization, maybe even a different industry. One of the ways they were able to do that was by increasing their confidence, being able to see that, in fact, successful people, just as it's not a linear path, they often make a number of mistakes along the way. But most of these mistakes can be, you can recover from them. You can go back. Like if you come to a fork in the road, you choose one path, it turns out to not be the most amazing thing. It usually is quite possible, to go back and do something totally different. So I think the mindset is one of confidence. The mindset is one of, looking to security as being something that you're creating for yourself. Even if you're not an entrepreneur, you can still create security for yourself in your job, in your career.
Right. So going back to that experimentation thing, you talk later on in the book about being willing to, fold, right, when it's not
Mm.
working out, and knowing that there's always another game to play,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. I mean, we talk about, if you think about traditional American or Western entrepreneurial advice, or like the classic manifest destiny philosophy, it is like, never give up, always persevere. And I think that's terrible advice. Again, most successful people, they have given up on a lot of things. They haven't necessarily given up on their dream. Like they're still trying to find that work they were born to do. They're still trying to, be a good person and maybe pursue a quest or whatever it is. But they're absolutely willing to go back and try a different strategy. They're willing to start something over, to admit that they got it wrong, or maybe it wasn't wrong, maybe it was a learning experience that led to the next thing. So I'm a big fan of, if it's not working, give up, do something else.
Yeah, I love how you go after that story everyone likes to tell about the guy who was digging for gold, right? And like
Right, right.
everyone else gave up, but he kept on and like he struck the vein. But
Hmm.
whenever I've heard that, like, what if he wasn't near the vein and he kept
Yep,
going?
yep.
That's a
Exactly, right? We
possibility.
don't know. That's the thing. It's like we don't know what would have happened. And the whole story of the poem of the two roads, the road not taken or the road less traveled by, the traveler kind of comes up on this decision, and he looks at one, he looks at the other, kind of evaluates, then he chooses the one road, and he says, that made all the difference. Which is great, but we don't know what happened. What would have happened if he had gone down the other road? Maybe it would have been just as good. Maybe it would have been better.
Right. And like going back to the gold guy, he could have stopped and started selling gold digging stuff for all the other ambitious gold diggers and
Exactly.
made a ton of
Exactly.
money off of it.
Right. So we don't know, right? So I think maybe the lesson is we put so much pressure on ourselves. We put so much pressure to like not make the wrong decision. And, again, there are very few career decisions that you can't recover from. And, by actually embracing different decisions, being open to change, that is probably how you're going to make progress one way or another.
Right. And I think this is great advice, particularly for people who are young guys who are in their 20s just starting out. I think a lot of them think they have to have things figured out right now.
Hmm.
And if they don't, like their life is hosed.
Right, right. Well, that's the culture. I mean, this is the culture that, I should say collectively, like we kind of put on those young people because they feel like they're supposed to know their life purpose when they're age 20. And there's a lot of people age 30, 40, 50, whatever, who don't know their life purpose. It's a journey. And the other thing is you have to make all these decisions with limited information, right? So you're supposed to choose, okay, I'm 16 or 17 or 18, like, what am I going to study and how am I going to study it? What college or what trade school or what, am I going to go into the military? Am I going to work for the government? All these kind of things. You don't necessarily know what that's going to be like. You might have a brochure that tells you a little bit, or maybe you know somebody who is in that field, but until you have the experience, you won't actually know. So, the way you figure out what you're born to do is you get experience. You are open to experiment. You say yes to things more than you say no, at least at first. Maybe
Right.
later you become more selective, but in the beginning you say yes.
Right. And that's going, just getting started, starting to take those risks, starting to experiment.
Hmm.
Right.
Absolutely.
The world economy is competitive, and there's not a day that goes by where I don't read these like scare articles about artificial intelligence taking over jobs that were once even white collar jobs, right? So
Right.
like reporters and accountants and even
Yep.
attorneys. Um, so in this new world where you're not only competing with humans in other parts of the world who can maybe do work for cheaper, but you're
Right.
also competing with computers, what skills do people need to focus on developing so they can compete, whether it's in the traditional job world or in starting their own business and being an entrepreneur?
So I think the first thing to recognize is in this time of uncertainty, when things are changing, artificial intelligence, as you said, the global economy, et cetera. I mean, first of all, the world has always been changing, right? Maybe it's changing more rapid or something now than it was before, but the times are always changing essentially. And whenever the times change, there are opportunities as well as there are challenges. And historically, especially in the United States, a lot of really big businesses were started during a recession. So a recession is a time, when people are kind of looking around and looking for something different. So first of all, the changing job market offers opportunities. As for what skills are important, I was surprised to see, I talked to people who were web developers, they were designers, firefighters, teachers, lawyers, accountants, all kinds of different backgrounds. What I was surprised to see was that there's a difference between hard skills and soft skills. And so hard skills are the skills that you learn in college or however you're educated, however you're trained. You learn to be a web developer, you learn a programming language, you learn specific engineering skills, whatever your trade is. But soft skills are kind of more universal and they apply to a lot of different professions. So soft skills are things like communication, being able to negotiate in a way that's both good for you, but also kind of creating a win-win for the other party as well. The ability to follow through and follow up. And we talked about, being in a meeting earlier, and they look around and like, who should do this? They look to the person who's going to follow up well, because we've all been in meetings where lots of good stuff is talked about, but then nothing ever happens afterward. So what I learned was that these soft skills are extremely important, and they're actually kind of underestimated. So something you can do, right away, and I talk about it a lot in the book, is to begin improving those soft skills. Don't just go back and learn another programming language. Don't just advance your technical skills. Those are important. But a lot of people have technical skills. And when you talk about a competing or competitive job market, I think the people who stand out are the ones who have better soft skills. They communicate better. They follow through better. They're just kind of better all around in those things.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think this is really applicable even for people who are in what we would traditionally call blue collar jobs,
Mm-hmm.
right? The emphasis is always on the hard skills. You got to be good, right? You have to be a good
Sure.
plumber. But in my experience as a homeowner, whenever I've had to call a plumber for things, I always go with the plumber who's got those soft skills down, right?
Yep.
Who know
Yeah,
how
he
to
calls you back.
communicate,
Like he
calls me
doesn't leave you
back,
waiting. Right. Exactly.
doesn't leave you
You feel like
waiting.
he's honest with you. All that stuff.
Right. So yeah, I mean, that's if you are in that sort of job, like yeah, that can really easily set you apart from the pack.
Mm-hmm.
It's just focusing on that.
Yeah.
Um, so let me ask you about this. So you mentioned, I guess we just talked about that. You answered a question that I already asked. Okay, let's talk about this. Getting into the specifics, if you have an idea of what your dream job is, like you figured it out, you know what you're good at, you know
Yeah.
it brings you joy, you know that it's something that could bring you sustainable money.
Sure.
How do you go about getting it? And what's
Yeah.
let's talk about what's the usual way people do it, and why is that a bad way of going about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the usual way is kind of like, throwing a lot of things, throwing spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks and sending out a ton of resumes, going on LinkedIn, kind of spamming people and all of that. I don't say spamming people in a terrible way because it's just what people do. Like they don't know. And the problem is that you're not the only one doing this, right? And when automation came along, like the ability to upload your resume, the ability to kind of send it out digitally to lots of people, in some ways it sounds great because you're like, well, now I can apply for 90 jobs instead of just like two or three. but there's probably 100 other people or 1,000 other people who are now actually applying for the same 90 jobs. So it's really, really hard to stand out by kind of going that traditional way. I mean, you have to be, the best of the best, in that 99th percentile, or you just have to get lucky, right?
Right.
Because I think a
Yeah.
lot of it just kind of comes down to randomness and chance, and maybe 10% of the applicants are all really qualified. So, they just kind of rolling the dice there. So most dream jobs are actually kind of found through referral. And I talk a lot in the book about the strength of weak ties, which is essentially your extended network. So your friends of friends, your people that your colleagues know, the people that you went to school with, talking to those people, and then talking to the extended networks of those people, are looking for connections. That's usually a much, much better way. Any way that you can kind of get your resume in through the back door is almost always going to lead to a better chance of success than just going through the normal route. And then the other thing I would mention is that a lot of dream jobs are not found, they're actually created. And when I say created, I don't necessarily mean starting a business or quitting your job. I saw a number of dream jobs that were created within an organization or within a company by somebody who had been a really good employee, kind of stood out, was good at their technical skills, but was also a good leader, had these kind of soft skills, and then identified an area that the company or the organization needed to grow in, and essentially created their own role for it by advocating and showing the value of that role, by showing why they were qualified to do it. So sometimes the dream job is not necessarily out there waiting for you. It's something that you have to kind of design yourself and then advocate for. But if it can work, obviously you've got something great for yourself, and it's also great for the people who are employing you.
So even if you're employed and you want a dream job, you have to act like a free agent in a way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of my lessons, for people is, you should think like an entrepreneur, even if you don't want to be an entrepreneur. You should think entrepreneurially. You should think creatively. You should try to think, how can I apply, like I said, this backdoor kind of thinking. How can I apply, be thinking like, how there's another way. There's got to be an alternative than just like this linear path of like, if there's 12 stages in an organization, I go in at stage 1, and then 2 years later, I get to move up to stage 2, and then 20 years later, maybe I'm at stage 8 or 9, and then I kind of plateau. There has to be another way, and we all know people who skip levels. We all know people who are kind of like, wow, they were on this track, like step 1, step 2, but now they're at step 5. What did they do? What did they do that was different? And I think a big part of it is being indispensable, being super reliable, being that kind of go-to person.
So let's talk about starting your own business a bit, because your first book was $100 startup, I believe, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Second book, but yeah.
Second book, yeah. Sorry about that.
It's good.
'Cause you've written a lot. Hard to keep track. But you're a big advocate of people starting what you call side hustles, even if they have a traditional job where they work 9 to 5 and they're making decent money. Why should folks like this consider starting a business on the side or moonlighting?
Yeah, so I've made a little bit of a transition just in my own philosophy because, I am kind of pro-entrepreneurship because that's my own background, but I recognize that's a little bit of a bias. So for this book, it was really exciting to see people who had kind of found a dream job within a company or organization. I talked to the first female firefighter in Ontario who became that firefighter 20 years ago, and talked about all the struggles and challenges she went through to achieve that position. I mean, if you want to be a firefighter, you can't really do that freelance. You have to be part of an organization. You have to go through the discipline and the process. So totally think that's awesome. But what I think even more, though, is I believe even more in the value of a side hustle. And I think it's actually an imperative. I think it's a necessity. It's not just something that's nice. And there are 2 reasons. One, because of what we've been talking about of the changing economic times, the instability, the fact that there is no job security, at least no long-term job security anymore, and no one will ever care about your career as much as you do. So that sounds kind of negative. But the other reason is because I've seen over and over and over, I get these emails all the time from people who started a little business just while they were working their job. Maybe they even liked their job. They had no plans to quit, but they did this thing on the side, just a few hours a week. And maybe it didn't bring a lot of money, but when it brought the first sale or they got their first client or customer, it brings a disproportionate amount of joy and satisfaction. And you kind of look at that. I get these emails that are like, oh, I made $30, and I'm so excited. I had to work, 10 hours to get that first $30 or something, but it's great, and it feels very empowering. So it's this confidence, it's this security, it's being able to look and say I have more than one income source. Even if that income source is relatively small, it's still great. And in some cases, I talked to lots of people who actually had just planned to start something small, but it did actually grow, to the point where they had to make a choice between their day job and the business. And there's different ways to navigate that choice, but it's a great problem to have, right?
Yeah, yeah, I love that because I did some side hustling too to help pay off my debt, student loan debt.
Hmm.
And my wife did as well, and it wasn't that hard, right?
Yeah.
Like, so can you give us some examples of people who have side hustles who work a regular 9 to 5 job that you
Yeah.
highlighted in your book?
Yeah. I talked to a woman who developed a kind of a crafts business, like a fabric arts business. Let's see. I'm realizing I'm talking to the art of manliness, so I should probably have a more manly example, just as I tell that one.
A whiskey
Okay.
distiller or something. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So this woman actually made whiskey. No, just kidding. Um, so there's a story of this guy named Benny Shu, and Benny was working a day job. He had kind of dabbled in entrepreneurship a little bit. It was like a hobby, and he had this idea to design T-shirts. And he didn't have a background in apparel. He didn't really have a background in design either. He just kind of waded into this. And over about 3 to 6 months, he invested a little bit of money, not a lot, but a little bit of money in putting these designs out on Facebook. And the really creative thing about it was when he first had the business, he had to actually do the screen printing and stock inventory and all of that, which of course comes with risk and challenge. You don't necessarily know if you're going to sell that inventory, et cetera. But he found a way to essentially do print on demand for customers he didn't have. So he had no platform, he didn't have a profile, he didn't have an email list or any of that. But through this process of experimentation, by investing a little bit of money, I mean, we're talking like a couple of $100s a month, he was able to get to where this became a viable business, creating these new T-shirt designs, putting them up through Facebook ads, seeing which ones people liked, and essentially people vote with their wallet. If there's 10 designs and they buy one, that's the one you stick with. And then it actually became a full-time business for him. So it took about a year or so, but it kind of came down to where he had to choose, okay, do I stay in my job or do I grow this business? And for him, he chose to grow that business. And there are lots of stories like that. And not all of them, to be clear, not all of them lead to, okay, now I'm making this full-time income. But again, I think the principle is like, what can you do on the side that will help you and give you more confidence and security?
Right. And you have to be willing, going back to that idea we've been talking about throughout this conversation, being willing to experiment.
Absolutely.
Because some things aren't going to work out.
Yep.
Well, think about how do you decide? Say, like you start a side hustle, right?
Okay.
You have a traditional job, and it goes off like gangbusters for whatever reason. How do you decide whether to take your side hustle full time? Because I think that might be a big agonizing decision for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, as I said, it's a good place to be. It's kind of like, it is a problem. I agree, but it's kind of like the problem of having too much money. And I have to pay my taxes. I mean, you have to sort that out, but still, like, wouldn't you rather be in that position than not having the money or whatever? I think the way that some people have navigated it is they have actually chosen to stay in their job, but they stay in their job. They're very clear that they're staying in their job because they like their job, and they realize that the job actually offers maybe a different environment than the side hustle or the growing business. Something I learned was that we focus a lot on profession, like what do you want to be when you grow up? And I am a so-and-so, I'm a so-and-so. We don't focus enough on what I called working conditions. So working conditions are like how you spend your time, like how you do your best work. Do you like to work with people? Do you like to work by yourself? Like for most of us, it's kind of a blend of both of those things. So where is the balance for you? How do you like to be rewarded or motivated or incentivized? All those kind of things. If you can figure out your working conditions, that will help you see, okay, I'm actually better off in this role for a while. Maybe I'm actually better off, pioneering my own thing, or maybe I'll go back and forth, because these days lots of people are kind of pursuing a hybrid lifestyle where for a while maybe they do work a job, but then they have something on the side that takes off. So I think that if you're in that position, you stay with the job if the job is bringing you great satisfaction. And if all of a sudden it changes, if that environment changes, and it becomes stressful, well, then you have something else to go to.
Right, right. One thing I've seen with people who have taken a side hustle full time, and they quit their day jobs, they discover that they actually don't like running a business.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
They like to start things. They like to like kind of work in the business, but the management aspect doesn't really appeal to them. So they'll maybe sell their business or maybe even just shut it down or scale it
Hmm.
back and go back to a traditional job because that's where they feel comfortable, and that's okay, right?
Yep, it's totally okay. I mean, the whole point is finding something that works for you, the ideal scenario that works for you. So one thing that's helpful there is to kind of get an understanding of the level of autonomy that you're most comfortable with. And people are totally on a spectrum with this. You know, some people do want to be like 100%, independent. I want to be on my own. I want to make my own decisions. I don't want a boss telling me what to do. Other people, they actually benefit from having some structure. They actually benefit from having set hours, from having some accountability, to knowing what the deliverables are, and then being able to work toward those deliverables. That's not a bad thing at all. I mean, you can be very successful in life at a high level, in an environment where there are clear deliverables and there is some structure.
Right. Well, hey, Chris, this has been a great conversation. A lot of practical takeaways, but where can people find out more information about the book?
Awesome. Well, as I said, it's a huge honor. Love to connect with people. I'm at chrisguillebeau.com or Chris Guillebeau on social, and nobody can ever spell that. So you can also go to bornforthisbook.com to learn about the new book.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thanks so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks, Brett.
My guest today was Chris Guillebeau. He's the author of the book Born for This, and you can find more information about that book at bornforthisbook.com, and you can purchase it on amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. And also make sure to check out the show notes for links to resources that we mentioned in this podcast. You can find that at aom.is/bornforthis.